As Jen mentioned, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our webinar today, 2016 Plan Giving Donor Trends. Who's giving today? Best opportunities for dollars tomorrow. My name is Nathan Stelter. I'm the Vice President for Business Development here at the Stelter Company. And as an industry leader in plan giving marketing, we're committed to providing innovative solutions and education for your marketing needs. And today, very, very happy to provide you with this complimentary webinar presented by our Director of Marketing, Cheryl Sturm, and Dr. Russell James, a professor at the Department of Personal Financial Planning at Texas Tech University. A couple quick notes about our webinar series before we begin. As I mentioned, we're excited to bring this to you. It's we've been working at doing these for a couple years with a full slate of industry experts, and it's always a complimentary webinar series. You can be assured you'll never see Stelter product solutions promoted on these webinars. They're strictly educational-based topics that you've shared with us as points of interest. And after this webinar today, you'll be asked for other topics. So if there are other things we should be aware of, please let us know. Today's webinar is actually our fifth in the series for 2016. If you've missed any of the other ones, you can access those as we archive those on our website at stelter.com/webinars. Some of those topics include engaging donor conversations, blended gifts with Jeff Comfort out at Oregon State, working successfully with professional advisors with Lanny Starkey, and Lynn Gomer and Craig Ruck did a great one on the basics of CGAs. Coming up in September, we have another one on the docket with our good friend Kathy Sheffield, from Foundation Director at All Saints Health Foundation. She's actually going to present a webinar on gift acceptance policies named Gifts Can Be Dangerous. So you'll be seeing some emails and invites to that in the near future. For today's webinar, I'd like to introduce our presenters. First up is Stelter's own Cheryl Sturm. She's our Director of Marketing, has over 30 years of global communications and marketing experience. She's responsible for the overall marketing and positioning of Stelter and our brand. Has worked, prior to joining us, had worked 10 years in the biotech industry and was responsible for launching new ingredient products around the world. Has also worked with Young and Rubicon's advertising Midwest office here as a senior VP and helped build brands for some big organizations as John Deere, Blue Cross Blue Shield, and Lotto. Presenting alongside Cheryl is a gentleman that maybe some of you have heard of, Russell James, professor for the Department of Personal Financial Planning at Texas Tech University. Dr. James directs the on-campus and online graduate program in charitable financial planning. He additionally teaches charitable planning at Texas Tech University School of Law, graduated cum laude from University of Missouri School of Law, PhD in Consumer Economics from University of Missouri, and prior to that actually was in the industry as a Director of Plan Giving for Central Christian College, where he later served as president of that same college. Many of you have probably seen and heard some of the great research that Dr. James has brought to the field over the last couple years, and he's been quoted and published many times, as you can see by a little bit everybody in the media. Looking at the attendee list, it looks like we have a lot of good friends, and you've already heard me speak enough. So I'm actually going to hand it over to Cheryl and Dr. Russell James.
Thank you, Nathan. Today's information comes from a study called the Natural Marketing Institute's Healthy Aging Database Study. It's the 11th year of the study, looking at various aspects of healthy aging, everything from food and diet to technology, finance, and just a wide range of things that we experience as we age. So the study is actually drawn from a Nielsen panel of over 500,000 individuals. This year's study, we had nearly 3,500 respondents, and it's matched to U.S. Census data across a number of key demographics, including gender, age, income, education, region, and race, as you see on your slide. We also broke it, again, matched to census data by generation. You'll see that the study is comprised of about 38% millennials, 20% Gen X, 34% boomers, and 7% matures. What's interesting about this is the very first year that we see millennials as actually a larger group than boomers. And we'll see this obviously moving forward for more than a decade. The study is statistically significant at the 95% confidence level at plus or minus 1.5%. And what that means is if we were to repeat this study 100 times, that 95 times out of 100, we would expect very similar results with no more than a 1.5% difference. This seems like maybe an odd place for someone like the Stelter company to get involved. But for us, it was an amazing opportunity. The Natural Marketing Institute, and it's a very well-known firm out of the Philadelphia area, they allowed us to work with them in forming the core questions regarding charitable giving. And for the last 2 years, they've allowed us to embed some proprietary questions that would help us dig a little bit deeper into not only what planned giving donors might be thinking prior to making a gift, but also just various changes that they went through as they aged. This study yielded almost 1 million different data points, and so obviously with just an hour, we're just going to touch the surface today of some of the key findings. And the biggest reason that Stelter got involved in this study is we have always been very curious about key differences across the various nonprofit sectors. There's a lot of great data out there, but we never really saw a study that would allow us to look deeply into how donors looked at giving to various sectors and to really verify whether or not there were any key differences. So today's presentation, we're breaking it into 3 areas. The first is general observations. Then we'll look a little more deeply into planned giving, and finally finish up with some marketing communication opportunities. Right, so let's start by looking at changes in charitable giving between 2015 and 2016. In the last 2 years, the study was actually conducted between April to April. So the data, the 2016 data that you're going to see today comes from donors who made a monetary donation between April of 2015 and April 2016. Now there's some key numbers here that we need to take kind of a look at. So you might want to write this number down. 77% is the number of adults over the age of 18 in the U.S. who claim to have made a monetary donation to a nonprofit in that time period. And the slide actually shows by sector the percentage of donors who gave to that particular nonprofit sector. So, for example, with human services, where we see that's almost 51%, that means that 51% of the 77% who actually gave said they gave to a human service. Now, I want to make it very clear that we're talking about just a basic donation, not planned giving particularly. And this could be any amount, from somebody who put a $1 into a red kettle at Christmas time to somebody who wrote a multi-million-dollar check to an organization. So as we look at the rankings, human services again was number 1 in 2016. You just see the 2015 rank just to its right. It is on and on down the line, medical research coming into 2nd place, healthcare into 3rd, and then at the bottom looking at secondary education. Now, these numbers may look a little bit different to you, perhaps than what you just saw in the recent 2015 Giving USA study, the new numbers that came out in June. And the reason for that is we split out faith-based global from faith-based local. So if you saw that study, the 2015 Giving USA study with religion in number 1 place, I'm sure these numbers would also be the same. But we specifically want to look at faith-based global institutions. And the same thing with education here. Throughout today's study results, you're going to see education broken between higher education and the secondary education level. One thing I always think is helpful is just to kind of go back and review these generational descriptions. I know time gets away from me, and so I always think it's helpful to look at ages here. So our millennials are now between the ages of 19 and 39. Gen X is between the age of 40 and 51. Our boomers, our first boomers actually turned 70 this year, so they're now between the ages of 52 and 70. And when we talk about matures, we're going to be talking about individuals who are age 71 on up. So this first slide is a very good example of what we talk about when we're talking about differences in the sectors. If we look at the general population of donor profiles, males are coming in at 48% and females at 52%. I thought you might be interested in seeing what the sector range is from high to low. And what this means is that, for example, in our arts and culture sector, 63% of the donations that came in that April to April 2016 period actually came from males. And on the low end, at 47%, that's actually healthcare. Of course, we see the flip-flop on the females. Same thing, we have a gap of 10 in that average ages, where our faith-based global donors are actually on the older end of the spectrum, and our public society benefit donors are on that low end. You also see a big gap there on whether or not someone had children in the household, with secondary education on top at 55%, and again, arts and culture on that lower end. When we look at things like median income and median net worth and college, we see similar numbers here from a range scale, where in each case our education donors are on the high end and human services are on the low end. We see much less variance when it comes to ethnic diversity, but we do see some differences. For example, with our white population, environmental happens to be on the high end and secondary education is on the low.
You know, Cheryl, I think yeah, sure. I think this points out the importance of knowing your particular donors versus knowing about donors in general. Because what works for one organization in one particular sector, it might not work for another. We actually see this come up a lot in academic research. For example, religious donors and environmental cause donors tend to have dramatically different characteristics. Also, keep in mind that knowing the donor characteristics for your particular organization or cause can be in particular valuable, because targeting that differs from your competitors is much more valuable than targeting that matches your competitors. Let me explain what I mean. Suppose that everybody learns, for example, that left-handed people are 20% more likely to donate. Well, you learn that, so you increase your outreach to left-handed people, but so do all of the other nonprofits. Now, even though left-handed people are 20% likely to be donors, they end up getting 50% more requests, which actually makes them less likely to respond to your particular request because they get so many of them. What this means is that finding characteristics specific to your sector, your cause, or your organization can be a lot more valuable than using indicators that everybody else is using. That's one piece that I think makes this research so exciting. Of course, in this webinar, we don't have time to do a precise breakdown of every individual sector, but the data is there, and I know, Cheryl, you recently presented that kind of a breakdown for universities within the Big 12 Conference, looking at giving within their states to higher education. So the potential is exciting.
Thanks, Russell. Let's just take a quick look at donating behavior across some of our demographic groups. And again, we have much more data than this, but these are some of I think, the more common demographic breakdowns. So we mentioned that we have our general population at 77%. We see really no difference really between gender. When we get into our generational breakdowns, though, and you see that little asterisk behind the numbers for boomers and matures, this indicates that they are statistically significantly higher than our millennial and Gen X groups. When we look at household income, no surprises probably here. The higher our household income group is more likely to be donating. When we look at whether or not there are children living in the household, that's pretty even. We really don't see any statistically significant differences in our 4 ethnic breaks. We do, however, start seeing some big statistically significant difference when we look at net worth, where our middle band, our $500,000 to $2 million net worth, and net worth over $2 million is statistically significantly higher than those with a net worth of less than $500,000. We also look at marital status, and in this case, married with partners, divorced, and widowed all are statistically significantly higher than single, never married. Now, these numbers are pretty consistent with what we saw in 2015, with the exception of that last category, that widowed category. And this is a bit of a jump from 2015 and the first time that we see that number as statistically significantly different than our other groups. One thing we get asked a lot is about restricted donations. Are there differences? Who's going to be making them? And really, how much should an organization really look at whether or not they should be offering opportunities for restricted donations? As you can see, there's not a lot of difference here across the sectors. Education is going to come in the highest this year at 36%. Again, not a huge jump from our other categories. And conversely, you would expect to see the same with unrestricted donations.
You know, Cheryl, there's some fascinating academic research on the topic of restricted donations. There's been a number of experiments, some of them even large scale, that show that when people are offered the ability to make restrictions on their gifts, both the willingness to donate and the size of donations increase. Now, that's not really too much of a surprise, and originally researchers thought this was because it was related to giving more power to the donors. That is, it gives them contract rights. But later research has found something even more fascinating, and that is that offering the ability to make specific restrictions on their gifts increased giving even for those who didn't use the restrictions. It appears that offering the ability to make specific restrictions may be effective in part because describing a specific project allows the donor to more easily visualize the impact of their gift. In other words, it makes the gift more tangible and more specific. This result actually corresponds with some of the results we've gotten from our neuroimaging work at Texas Tech Neuroimaging Institute. In one case, in a study where we were looking at people deciding to name charities as beneficiaries in their wills, we found that greater activation in the visual cortex regions during the decision-making process was associated with a greater likelihood of naming the charity in the will. In other words, it may be that offering restrictions or actually otherwise describing more specific projects helps the donor to visualize that impact, and that makes the giving opportunity that much more compelling.
That's very interesting. Let's move now into some more specific data looking at planned giving. As I'm sure it comes to no surprise to all of our listeners today, getting people to give to your organizations is becoming more and more competitive. So one of the proprietary questions that we asked is, if you were to consider leaving a gift to charity, which of the following would you be likely to do? Would you be likely to give 100% of your gift to a single organization? Would you split gifts? Or would you not leave a gift at all? And as you can see from the numbers, the younger the generation, the more likely they are to answer that they would leave a gift to a single organization, and also the higher likelihood of splitting gifts. And as we move up the generation gap, we see that our matures are the audience that says that they would be least likely to split gifts and least likely to leave a gift at all. The group that's of big interest, I think, a lot of our listeners, and one that we get the most questions about, are boomers. And as you can see, we've got about half of our boomers who still say that they would not leave a gift, and we've got a large group who say that they would split gifts. And if we look at just the group who say they split gifts in totality, that's about 46% of our respondents. And so of that 46%, we asked them, if you were to sign a will in the next 6 months, how many charitable organizations would you be likely to include? So first we looked at just the gender split. And we didn't see a huge difference here, fairly similar in the split of who would leave one gift. We do see that women are more likely than men to say that they would split it between just 2 organizations. And then when we look at 3 or more, we see those numbers are pretty even. Now, that's really important data as we move into this next slide. There's a very interesting study that Blackbaud did back in 2013 where they looked at the number of gifts that each one of these generational bands were most likely to give. And at that point in time, which really isn't that long ago, 3 years ago, our matures were averaging about 6.2 different organizations. Our boomers at 4.5, Gen X at 3.9, and our millennial group at 3.3. And as you can see, those numbers, particularly in our 2 oldest groups, our boomer group and our mature group, that has dropped significantly. So in the case of our millennials, 62% are saying that they would leave to no more than 2 groups. We're at 64% there on Gen X, 58% with boomers, and 55% still with our mature audience. And overall, about 90% of all respondents are saying that they would leave a gift to 3 organizations or fewer.
You know, Cheryl, as a researcher, I find this to be fascinating because we have relatively little information on the number of charities named in a will by age. There's even been some discussion about the likelihood that older adults gradually drop out charities and narrow the number of organizations that they name, but we don't see strong evidence of that taking place here. Now, what we can't observe and what could be happening is that people could be changing the charities listed. For example, different ages prefer different causes, and we see this in that the dollars tend to group around the causes preferred by those in their 80s when the dollars are actually transferred. And in other studies, we see there's a great deal of instability in that charitable component, either completely dropping all charity or adding in charity when it didn't exist before, around major life events such as marriage, divorce, birth of a child or grandchild, or diagnosis with a serious illness. So given that, I think it's important not to get in the habit of what I call count it and forget it when it comes to revocable gifts. It's important to remember these gifts are revocable, and we have to stay connected with donors all the way through to the end.
That leads us nicely into our next questions, looking at really estate planning documents. Not only who's got what, but in this case, how important are donors today looking at various types of estate planning documents. So we're going to start off with just general wills. We know a large percentage, 80-90% of our gifts are coming in from a simple will or bequest. So the question was asked, how important is it to have a will? So 41% of men and 45% of women responded that they think having a will is very important, but yet you see the numbers drop off drastically when we look at who actually has a will. Only 35% of men and yet only 30% of women. These numbers, as you might expect, tend to go up with age. So now we're going to look at importance and prevalence based on our generational gaps. So millennials, 1 in 3 said it's very important to have a will. A little bit less than half with Gen X. Our boomers, again, still less than half saying that it's very important to have a will. And then we see a big increase when we get into that mature audience of 71 on up. As far as the numbers who actually have a will, those numbers are low. as you might expect, our millennials are less than 20%, Gen X at 28%, but then again, boomers, and this is the age group that so many people are focusing on right now. Just 44% actually have a will, where, again, we see that big jump with maturers. And then that bottom number, that is actually the percentage of individuals in that generation band who have no estate planning document of any kind.
Cheryl, here's where we see, of course, that contrasting picture among ages. Younger adults are much more open to the concept of making a gift and a will if you ask them, but they don't actually have wills. As people age, they become more likely to have will documents. These results actually correspond with other studies in this country and in other countries that find similar results. It points out that giving a gift and a will involves two steps. First, you have to get a person to agree with the idea, but then you actually have to get them to execute it. And those can be two very different challenges. For example, in the previous slide, you may have noticed that women were more likely to say a will was very important, but they were less likely to actually have one. I believe the first step is to shift people's attitudes about leaving a gift to your organization. If you have the resources then to work individually with specific donors, you may be able to walk them through the completion process. But even if you don't, it's a legitimate approach to focus on marketing the concept of making a gift and a will, shifting attitudes, and then just waiting for planning to take place naturally when it's triggered by the normal course of life events.
Take a look at some documents beyond the basic will. In this case, we gave some general descriptions of living trusts, joint ownership of property, beneficiary designations, transfer on death designations. And you can see our first column there is our total population, with wills coming in highest, beneficiary designations, another common estate planning document, coming in second, and then looking at living trusts on down. In this case, we see a big bump when we move from Gen X into boomers. And we see another bump then when we look at differences between the boomer generation and the mature generations. I want to point out, though, on this slide, particularly looking at beneficiary designations, where we see a big bump here between millennials and Gen X. This is one area, just for sake of time today, that we aren't going real heavily into, but this may be one of the areas where we saw the largest differences between regions of the country, where for whatever reason the Midwest comes in particularly high with beneficiary designations compared to other parts of the country. Kind of looking at the same thing, only how it compares with net worth. Again, this is an area where we see a major bump between that band of individuals with net worth less than $500,000 and individuals who have net worth between $500,000 and $2 million. And then we see another bump there between our mid band and our oldest band. One area where we saw the biggest increase that I wanted to point out is in that transfer on death designation, where we see the largest jump between our mid-band and our highest net worth.
You know, Cheryl, I think this is particularly interesting because it helps to explain some other findings we've seen in academic research. For example, we've seen a consistent drop in the share of older adults who have will documents. Year after year, since at least 1998, this percentage gets lower and lower. Now, one theory, and we actually haven't had good data before this study, was that this was a result of the shift towards non-probate transfers, such as a transfer on death, TOD, or beneficiary designations. We saw some evidence of this from the fact that the majority of decedents' wills were actually never probated because all of the assets had joint ownership, TOD, transfer on death, or beneficiary designations. In other words, the majority of wills that people die with actually control none of their assets. And here we see strong evidence of the importance of these titling transfers. One of the things that I found fascinating about this particular slide was that among those with wealth of at least $2 million, more of them actually had IRA beneficiaries than had a will. The majority also have transfer on death designations on their bank accounts. Plan giving fundraisers have really got to understand the fundamental concept that the will is just a backup document. It controls only those assets that don't have a beneficiary designation, transfer on death, or joint ownership with right of survivorship. And with recent changes in legislation, now most states even allow a transfer on death designation on real estate, meaning that you can TOD essentially every asset you own. And even if you have a will, it doesn't matter because it won't control anything. The idea that we can say, oh yes, we're in the donor's plan and we even have a copy of that page in their will, it's actually no longer valid when, because of these other designations, the majority of wills will control no assets at the time of death. Now, this reality is both good news and bad news. The reality makes things harder and it makes them easier. Let me explain why. It makes the gift conversation harder because that conversation doesn't start and end with a will. We have to go beyond that to find out how the assets are titled, because in the majority of cases the will actually controls nothing. However, if it makes the gift conversation easier, also because that conversation again doesn't start and end with a will. So for example, I can say, you know, if you have kids as a beneficiary on your traditional IRA or 401k, they have to pay income taxes on that money when they get it. But if you name the charity, those taxes are completely avoided. As a financial planner, of course, those are the first assets we want to leave to charity. Oh, and don't worry, you don't need to change your will. You don't even need to set up an appointment with your lawyer. Here, we can just go online with Fidelity or Schwab or whoever your account is with, and here is the box you fill in to change your beneficiary designation. That's it, and you're done.
Leads us really well, I think, into our next slide, motivations for signing or changing a will. I think as fundraisers, we're constantly looking for opportunity to talk to donors about how important it is to have a will, or look at opportunities from a timing standpoint on gift giving. And so if we look, the gold boxes in this case, these are the highest percentage response by these particular generations at different opportunities on why someone may be making a change in a will or creating a will for the first time. We see change in financial circumstances at the top of the list of our general population, and it is the #1 response from our boomer generation. Then birth of a child or grandchild with millennials and Gen X, and then down several jumps, death of a loved one, that being the #1 reason that matures give for either changing or making a will for a first time. And then at the bottom, interesting couple things we wanted to look at was either actually moving to a new city, state, or country, or preparing for travel.
You know, I think these are exciting results because they both confirm and they also extend previous academic research in the field. First of all, we find confirmation of factors that have been seen to be important in other studies. Changes to the estate plan occur with changes to the family structure or changes to mortality expectations. In other studies, we find that these changes include changes to the charitable component, both adding and dropping. Changes in financial circumstances was also a big factor here. In other studies, we've actually found that as wealth increases, people are more likely to add charity to their plans, although it tends not to get pulled out when wealth decreases. So it's kind of a sticky upwards concept. Finally, notice that we are getting substantial changes when people are moving or preparing for travel. As far as I know, this is the first study that has ever tested this factor, and it's showing up as relevant. In particular, notice that it is highly relevant for the younger ages, who are more likely to be moving or preparing for their first major travel experience. So if you're targeting this younger group, that's an important factor as well. However, among all the groups, notice what was the least likely motivation: interest in helping a charity. Again, this comes back to the issue that getting in the will is a two-step process. First, you have to shift people's attitudes to make them open to the concept, and then they have to execute. This suggests that getting them all the way through the process just for the sake of a charity, well, it can be a difficult task. But if you engage in what I like to call drip marketing, where you're always trying to shift the attitudes towards openness for making a gift in a will, then when one of these life events comes along and execution takes place naturally, you'll hopefully be in a good position to be remembered.
Let's look at specific gift giving again by sector. Again, I want to remind everyone that our time period is April 2015 to April 2016, and we asked donors how likely would they be to donate a charitable gift to an organization at the time of their death. Now, the gold band at the top represents the percentage of individuals that said that they have already left a gift to an organization in that sector in their will. I want to, again, go back and just clarify what we're talking about with these percentages, and I'm going to use human services again as an example here on the right. You see that gold band at 1%. So we're saying 1% of the 51% who said that they had left a gift in that category now are saying that they've left a gift in their will. And so you can each look at that by your specific sector. That light gray band just below that is the percentage of individuals who said that if approached properly, that they might be very likely to leave a gift in that sector. The blue is somewhat likely, and the black is the percentage of individuals who said that they are most likely not going to leave a gift in that sector. And then you see that band of numbers underneath then the graph, that very somewhat band. You can see that these are very high numbers. We have 56% in our education category and 42% in our human services category that are open to leaving a gift to an organization in that sector. Again, it goes back to what we talked about earlier about how competitive individual organizations are going to need to be in order to attract that donor, because our donors are giving to fewer organizations than they have in the past.
Cheryl, I think this is a fascinating result because it represents an enormous amount of potential dollars when we compare the top two sections of the graph. Notice that all of the dollars you're getting today from your estate gifts, they're just coming from the people in the gold who have actually completed this. But we've got a huge section of people who are in the gray who are very open to the idea. They just haven't done it yet. It fits with when we look at other research that shows that about 5.7% of adults over the age of 50 have a charity in their will or trust. But here we see that more than a quarter of people are open to the idea, very likely that they have a willingness to do this. It also may explain why in real-world tests, simply asking people if they want to include a charity in their will when they're talking with the lawyer more than doubles the share of people who actually include a gift in their will. People are very open to the idea, but they aren't acting on it. It's that action step that can be a barrier. And maybe the ability to simplify the process, such as by using a beneficiary designation or a transfer on death designation, can make it easier for people to take that step and actually execute when they're already saying that they're very open to the idea of making these gifts.
we have over 60 different ways that we can look at every question and every point in question in this study, but one that I wanted to pull out, again, this is on our group who said that they have already left a gift to a particular organization in their will, is the family makeup. I think there's some widespread confusion with some of our nonprofit organizations that in every case that someone who is childless is always going to be the best opportunity for gift giving. And in this case, you can see that in a number of our sectors, for example, arts and culture, human services, and faith-based, that individuals with children actually left a gift in their will at a higher rate than those who are childless. Now, as you can see, there are other organizations with very similar fairly even breakdowns, and then there are some where we see childlessness giving at a higher rate than those with children.
You know, in all of the research in the various studies that I've worked with or read, by far the strongest indicator of leaving an estate gift is childlessness. Now, I used to tell people, hey, you know, that's true, but it's impossible to base your entire campaign off of childless individuals because there's so few of them. But these are actually some of the most dramatic results I've seen. We're actually seeing that within some sectors, childless individuals are making up a majority of those who have actually included a gift. It's important to keep in mind that not only is this such a powerful factor, but childless individuals, that sector is increasing dramatically among older adults. As the baby boom population ages, they have a much higher level of childlessness than the older ages. So we're going to see this sector become even more and more powerful as these groups age.
Okay, that's an awful lot of numbers I know that we've been putting out here in the last 40 minutes or so. So let's move into our last section, which is really some marketing communication opportunities that anybody could take advantage of. First, this is a slide that we've seen in a number of different studies, including ours, really looking at why do donors choose to donate money to the organizations that they support. And first by far is it makes me feel good to help other people. The blue bar represents our 2015 numbers, and the red bar then is our 2016 numbers. And as you can see, down the line, there's very little difference. So starting with helping to feel good with other people, which really translates into that emotional approach, then followed by supporting a cause I strongly believe in, helps me feel good to help animals. And I want to point out something here. What these numbers are really saying from a communication standpoint is that rather perhaps than focusing on the animals themselves, that if you could focus on an individual perhaps who's going above and beyond to help individuals, telling the story about that individual may be a better approach than specific numbers about the animals themselves. And then we drop down to the bottom, and this is consistent across all studies, and for as long as I've seen these numbers, is it helps my financial situation at tax time. This slide also represents another one of Stelter's proprietary questions, and something we were very curious about, which is how much of a preference do individuals have on giving locally versus nationally or globally. And across the board, we see a very strong preference for giving to local organizations. And as we look at the various sectors, and we don't have time to do that in this hour, but there are some very unique ways on how each organization can define local. The one area that we see a little bit of difference on is we get down towards the bottom and we're looking at some of our ethnic breakdowns. We see more of a preference than in other areas to give to global organizations, and a lot of this has to do, I believe, with where natural disasters have occurred in various parts of the world. And in the time frame when this study was going on, we did see some very strong natural disasters happening in Asian countries.
Cheryl, this actually fits with a lot of research showing that people are, in general, more likely to give close to home. An otherwise identical local cause will outperform a faraway cause. Of course, there are many crises that occur overseas, and there's nothing comparable happening at home, and so that works with international charities. People prefer to give to others who are in some ways similar to them, and location is one of those factors. But this can be an issue in an organization where the leadership kind of wants to feed their ego by emphasizing global impact, but they sometimes are ignoring what motivates the donor, which more often tends to be local connections. I see this played out in a variety of other contexts where organizations will communicate that the leaders or the employees of the organization are the heroes instead of emphasizing that the donors are the heroes. Now, this approach is easy because it fits the worldview of the higher-ups in the organization and it gets approved easily, but it just doesn't work as well. We need to emphasize the donor hero story and donor preferences, not necessarily the nonprofit leadership hero story.
This is an area I wish I had more time on this, and this may be the next Stelter webinar, but the study looks at dozens of various concerns and then donor satisfaction level with those particular concerns. And one of them has to do with financial plans for retirement. And so we asked them to either agree, somewhat disagree, or totally disagree with the statement, I have a secure, financially sound plan for retirement. And as you can see, these numbers are pretty darn low. So we've got 15% of our total adult population, a lower percentage of women than men at 12% to 18%. And then when we look at our generational bands, we've got 13% of millennials, 10% of Gen X, 18% of boomers, and 26% of matures. And so, again, we're looking at a number of different factors that can be involved in this. One thing I want to talk about for just a second with Gen X, and it's become really interesting this year in looking at some other components of the study, is for a number of years we've talked about boomers being the sandwich generation. What we mean by that is boomers having financial responsibility for parents and having financial responsibility for children. We're seeing a shift to the Gen X generation in this category as our matures, more of them become deceased. We're seeing more Gen X being responsible for their boomer parents and still having millennial children also on their financial roles. And as we look at that generation a little more deeply, you'll see that there are a number of factors that contribute to that number being lower than the other generational bands. The bottom, the blue circles there, are our three net worth bands. And as you can see, we still have some pretty high concerns when it comes to having a secure plan for retirement. With just over 10% of our lowest net worth band, only 4 out of 10 in that mid band, that $500,000 to $2 million band, and then about 2 out of 3 with net worth of over $2 million, feeling pretty secure about their financial plans, but a very significant group of even individuals, even in that highest net worth band, that are extremely concerned about whether or not they're going to have enough money to retire.
You know, Cheryl, I'll just say this is a perfect place for planned giving. People are saying, I'd love to give, but I have these financial concerns, and we can open up that conversation by just saying, hey, what if there was a way that you could do both? That's what planned giving is all about.
Our final slide then is, let's look at specific types of gifts that donors may be interested in and see if there are any differences by generational or by net worth that might be more popular than others. And again, the gold bars represent the highest response by that particular grouping, whether it be age or whether it be net worth. And number one, across the board, except for that bottom bar on saving capital gains taxes, happens to be in that area of tribute gifts. We see very strong, and again, we can break this into 60 different categories. That honor and tribute gift comes up strong in 59 out of the 60 that we looked at. When we see, and you see even in that net worth over $2 million, a very small difference between the top box with tribute gifts and the bottom box with capital gains taxes. We see the biggest drop-offs again, between that top, honor and tribute gifts and CGAs in our total GP grouping. And that's pretty consistent across the board. Where we start to see more interest in a number of different gift types is in those two columns to the right, our mid-band, our $500,000 to $2 million range, and that $2 million break.
You know, I think one of the consistent results here is that across all of these instruments, interest is much higher than actual usage. That suggests there's a lot of untapped potential where if people learn about the vehicles, they have that interest in making these gifts. I was also excited to see the great level of interest in tribute giving. Tribute giving in the estate plan has been demonstrated as super powerful in an experimental setting, and I think it's underutilized. We've actually done research where we take people through that process of asking them about a family member who would have appreciated their support for a cause and asking them whether or not they would like to leave a gift in their will in honor of that family member. And for a large share of the population, it dramatically increases their interest in leaving a gift to these organizations. And what we found more recently using neuroimaging is that it actually completely changes the thought process that people are using as compared to when you just ask them upright for a gift in a will to the organization. So a lot of potential opportunity there.
Okay, Dr. James, thank you so much, and Cheryl as well. This ends the presentation that they put together, and now we're going to move into the Q&A section of the presentation. And we did have some questions that came in throughout the webinar. I also invite you to send in any additional questions. We have about 7 minutes left here at the end to address those. So going back to the beginning of the presentation, I'm actually going to go ahead and backtrack. Our first questions were about restricted versus unrestricted. And I think this is mostly to you, Russell. We have a question from Don, and he asked, does the ability to restrict to an endowment also apply to the likelihood to donate and to the size?
You know, I think anytime a restriction can be used to reference a more specific goal or project, anytime that it makes the impact of that gift more tangible, I think that makes it an easier ask. It makes it a more powerful opportunity for the donor. So if you have a restriction, let's say, rather than just a general ask for an endowment, if you're talking about a specific restriction to endow for a scholarship or endow for a particular project, anything that allows the donor to more easily visualize the tangibility of the impact of their gift, I think that's going to influence their interest in making the gift. And again, one of the reasons we think that that's part of the reason why restricted gifts are so powerful is because offering that restriction to restrict your gift to a particular segment of the nonprofit organization increased giving even among those who didn't use the restriction. Now, we haven't actually had research talking about restricting the gift to an endowment in general versus giving to the organization in general. All of this research was about restricting the gift to a particular segment of the organization or to a particular project. So that's what we've seen results in so far.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a couple of questions coming in, just some clarifications. We have one from Mary, and she's wondering if, Cheryl, if you can clarify again the difference between the education sector and the secondary education sector.
Sure, Jen. When we're talking about education, we're talking about colleges and universities. And with secondary education, we're talking about prep schools and high schools.
Okay. And then another clarification question from Martina. She asked, may I just clarify, are you saying that specific beneficiary designations supersede entries in wills?
So this is Russell, absolutely. The will is only a backup document, and people in plan giving or other kinds of fundraising need to know that. The will only controls those assets that do not have a transfer on death, pay on death, beneficiary designation, joint ownership with right of survivorship. They don't, they only control those assets without those things. So the transfer on death, the beneficiary designation, the joint ownership with right of survivorship, that controls regardless of what's in the will. So you can have a wonderfully drafted will that names your organization for 10% of the estate, and if all of those assets have beneficiary designations on them or joint ownership with right of survivorship, that will controls nothing. And the surprising fact is that what we've seen from nationally representative surveys is that most wills that people die with control no assets because they have added these other designations to all of their other assets. So we've got to go a step beyond the will signing process to actually find out how the assets are titled.
Okay, thanks, Russell. A question just came in from Scott. He would like some clarification around why the numbers about people who reported having a will or not having a will don't add up to 100%, and that's for Cheryl.
You'll actually see in a number of instances where the numbers won't add up exactly to 100%, and that's because we'll have individuals who either won't answer the question or who will answer that they don't know. So that's pretty common that you'll see across the data that not in every instance will we add up to 100%.
Okay. And Ed was asking, you were talking earlier about the importance of documents, and you were talking about beneficiary designations. He was curious if you mean any beneficiary or a charitable beneficiary.
So all of the same rules would apply to a charitable versus a non-charitable beneficiary as far as when they take precedence. And actually we see fairly similar results across all different kinds of beneficiaries. So for example, wills change in response to different kinds of life events. Those changes are seen in changes to the charitable beneficiary, but they can also be seen in changes to other components of the will plan or other estate plan.
Thank you so much, Dr. James, and also thank you to Cheryl Sturm, our Marketing Director, for spending the last hour with us. We are at the end of our presentation. If we didn't get to your question today, or if you have further questions on what was presented, please feel free to reach out to either Cheryl or Dr. James. You can see their information on the screen, their email addresses. They've both agreed. If you have questions, you can reach out to them, and they'd be happy to help you with that. And finally, as an industry leader in plan giving marketing, Stelter is committed to providing you solutions and education for your marketing needs. And so because of this, we are happy to provide you with this complimentary webinar today. And we will also be making the recording and the presentation slides available. That's probably the most common question I received today. Yes, you can download the slides and you can listen to the recording again. Those will both be available on our website at stelter.com/webinars. By Friday. You'll also receive an email instructing you when those become available. Thank you again for spending the last hour with us. We appreciate your participation in the webinar today, and we look forward to talking to you again soon. Have a great afternoon.